Many of you know today's distinguished guest from his previous visits here to Chappaqua. Unfortunately, the more I've learned, the more I've been confused about the Koreas in the Trump administration, Trump world. Fortunately, we have somebody who can help us to think through what's going on in a very dynamic and a very confusing and somewhat opaque environment. Evans Revere is a senior advisor at the Aldridge Stonebright Group, where he advises clients on entry and growth strategies throughout Asia region with a specific focus on Korea, China, and Japan. Evan brings decades of experience as an expert on Asia-related matters to his work with clients. During a distinguished 37-year career as one of the U.S. State Department's top Asia expert, he served as Acting Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs and Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary managing U.S. relations with the Asia-Pacific region. Renowned for his expertise on North Korea, he has hundreds of hours of negotiating experience with North Korean officials, frequently participates in official and informal dialogues with Pyongyang's representatives. Who better to help us to understand what's happening in today's complex, dynamic, and somewhat obtuse negotiations? Please help me welcome Evans Revere and his wife, who happens to be sitting in the back of the room, back to Chappaqua.
Thank you very much, Mal, and also thanks to Joan, and thank you all for being here this morning. I'm sitting here, and I have this feeling I should be adjudicating parking tickets in this room. So,
you may be.
So if I fine anybody, you'll know why. Seriously, it's a delight to be here again. This is my third time.
Yes.
I think. Oh my goodness, I must be doing something right. Or you have some hopes that I'll be doing something right someday, and you keep inviting me back to try. You mentioned earlier that this is your spring program.
Yes.
I find that interesting. I was out in my driveway shoveling snow at 5 o'clock this morning. That was my welcome.
Spring snow.
To your concept of spring. And I was really worried I might not get here, but 10 miles north of my house, there is no snow. So it's amazing. The further north I went, the less snow I saw. So welcome to the odd weather that we've been having here lately. As I was shoveling, I do my best thinking when I'm shoveling snow, I was wondering how I should open my remarks today and deal with some of the questions that you raised. And I thought maybe the best way to do it would be to open with a parable. Like many of you in the room, I'm a person of a certain age, and I like stories that begin with once upon a time. So let me begin with a story that begins once upon a time. Once upon a time, there was a commander-in-chief who had a reputation for arrogance, who was often criticized for having a messianic personality, who was often criticized for being very full of himself, and he was often called narcissistic. He liked to claim that he knew more than his generals about the battles that were being fought. He dismissed the value of the intelligence that he was being provided by his senior staff. He enjoyed firing people on the spot in a humiliating way. And he had a particularly difficult relationship with a senior Marine general. And this relationship, the more they got to work with each other, the worse it got. And as time went on, this commander-in-chief began to make some decisions that really troubled this particular Marine general. The Marine general was convinced that the commander-in-chief, for all the reasons that I hinted at a moment ago, was not capable of making the right decisions, since he was dismissing all of the good advice that he was getting, not only from this Marine general, but from all the other generals. And he was taking massive chances with the lives of the men and women under his command. But this commander-in-chief had a strong political following in certain circles, and he had a reputation for occasionally getting it extremely right, but also occasionally getting it extremely wrong. And this Marine general warned the commander-in-chief that it was not appropriate for the commander-in-chief to be declaring the virtual end of combat, and his decision in the next few weeks to remove all of the troops from the battlefield, because basically we've won this war. And the Marine insisted to this commander-in-chief that, sir, you're getting this wrong. This war is hardly over, and the next move that you want my troops and all the other troops under your command to make could result in the destruction of our forces in the field. The commander-in-chief insisted on going forward with the operation, and the result of this was the loss of thousands of American Marines and soldiers on the battlefield at a place called the Chosin Reservoir in Korea. The commander-in-chief that I'm talking about was Douglas MacArthur. The Marine general that I'm talking about is not General Mattis, although General Mattis would have been proud of him. It was a general named O.P. Smith, who was the commander of the 1st Marine Division, which, because of MacArthur's ill-advised decisions, was sent up into an area where it was promptly surrounded by an army of more than 300,000 Chinese and cut to pieces. The 10th Corps, which was on the flanks of the Marine Division, was cut to pieces by the Chinese, and the U.S. 8th Army was also cut to pieces by the Chinese, because MacArthur had divided his command. MacArthur had ignored the intelligence being provided by his experts in the field that there was a massive Chinese army facing him, and he said, no, there isn't. And he dismissed all of the advice of these people. So the parable provides some interesting lessons for how not to deal with the Korean Peninsula. And it also reminds us that when your generals tell us you may be doing something wrong, you might want to listen to them. So with that as background,
Not a bad start.
I should also add that the Marine general had a reputation for being a very learned, erudite, scholarly fellow. They called him the professor, not unlike General Mattis. But in any event, let me jump right in and lead off, if I might, this morning by giving you my conclusion right up front. The U.S. administration's Plan A, which has involved engaging directly with the North Korean leader in order to convince Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, to denuclearize, that plan has failed. It is now time to think of an alternative mechanism, because what we have tried is not working, and in my view, and in the view of most experts on North Korea that I know, including the generals, including the U.S. intelligence community, it's not going to work. And if we do not adjust course, it is my fear that it will lead to what several U.S. administrations have vowed never to allow to happen, which is that we will be dealing with a permanently nuclear-armed North Korea. That's my conclusion. That's my recommendation right up front. For the last quarter century, a series of U.S. administrations have tried to compel or convince North Korea to make a strategic decision about its nuclear weapons program. And today, in one of history's great ironies, an ill-advised and, in my view, deeply flawed summit that took place last June between President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has actually produced that strategic decision. Unfortunately, it's not the decision that we had hoped for, that North Korea would decide to give up their nuclear weapons. And nor is it the decision, the one that President Trump has assured us that the North Koreans have made. He keeps assuring us that the North Koreans have decided to give up their nuclear weapons. The contrary is true. The North Korean leader's bottom line, in my view, and I would say in the view of most experts that I know, that bottom line is now quite clear. North Korea plans to keep its nuclear weapons, most of them, if not all of them, freeze their nuclear and missile testing, which they've done, and offer Washington the vague promise is the operative word here, of future denuclearization, but a promise that the North Koreans will almost certainly not keep. The North Korean leader believes that he can improve ties with Washington, which he is in the process of doing. He believes that he can assure the world that North Korea will be a responsible nuclear weapon state, which he has done publicly. He believes that he can remove the U.S. military threat and end international sanctions. He believes he can do all of that simultaneously and keep his nuclear weapons. That's his game plan. The Singapore summit that I referred to took place on June 12th of last year, was filled with, and I'm sure you saw them, made-for-television moments. There was a lot of drama. It really was like a television serial. But it did nothing to bring about the actual denuclearization of North Korea. The sudden U.S. decision to hold the summit ensured there was not sufficient time to actually negotiate the sort of agreement that most experts recommended needed to be negotiated in advance of that summit. And as a result, the summit produced a brief and incredibly vague statement. I was in London during the summit, and a reporter sent me a note asking me to open up an email. He sent me a text asking me to open up an email he had read, that he had sent me. And I opened up my phone. I was sitting in Starbucks. It was about 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning. And he said, "Don't tell anybody, but I've got an advance copy of the summit declaration, and I'd like your comments on it, because we want to run this on the air in a few minutes." Now, the summit declaration hadn't even been signed yet, hadn't been issued, but this reporter, very enterprising reporter, had gotten a copy of it. And he said, "Give me your response as quick as you can, because I need to go on the air shortly." Looked at my phone, and I got to the bottom of the first page, and I said, "This isn't very impressive. Maybe the next page will be better." Flipped it and discovered that was it. There was no more in this declaration, and my reaction was, "Oh my God." And a few minutes later, the President of the United States and the North Korean leader signed that document. So the leaders went into that summit with a number of flaws already having been committed, not the least of which was that they didn't even have a common definition of what the word denuclearization means. And you may have noticed an article in the New York Times and other papers the other day that our special representative delivered a speech at Stanford University en route to meet his North Korean counterparts and said exactly that. He said, "We don't even have a common definition with the North Koreans about what we mean by the word denuclearization." For the United States, the word means what the dictionary says it means. Denuclearization, get rid of your nukes, full stop, period. For North Korea, they use this phrase, denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And if you look at that summit statement that our president signed on June 12th, that's the phrase that's in there. That phrase means for the North Koreans what it has always meant. It means the elimination of the U.S. threat posed by the U.S.-South Korea military alliance. It means the U.S. military presence on the Korean Peninsula needs to go. It means the U.S. alliance with South Korea needs to go. It means that the U.S. nuclear umbrella that we use to protect our South Korean and Japanese allies needs to be removed. And it means that the strategic and tactical military assets that we would use in the event of a second Korean War need to be withdrawn from the region. That's what denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula means to the North Koreans. What is missing from that definition? Yes. So, for the North Koreans, denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula means the elimination of America's ability to defend its allies and deter North Korea. That's what it means to them. And if there were a North Korean in the room and you were to put that question to him or her, they would tell you that. Yet the United States agreed to use North Korea's language in that summit statement, in the June 12th summit statement. The statement merely called for North Korea to work toward the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Not achieve the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, to work toward it. It's like telling my wife, I will work towards clearing the driveway. That's not a very good commitment. So you can imagine how willing the North Korean leader was to sign a statement that both affirmed Pyongyang's definition of denuclearization, didn't contain the U.S. definition of denuclearization, and it also required no concrete actions by North Korea to achieve even that goal of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And I suspect that Kim Jong-un was no doubt equally pleased that the U.S. president announced the unilateral suspension of major U.S.-South Korea defensive military exercises, a decision that shocked American military officials, came as a surprise to the commander of our troops in South Korea. He had no idea it was coming. Came as a surprise to the Pentagon. They didn't know it was coming either. And in his press conference after the summit, the President of the United States described our defensive exercises aimed at enhancing our ability to protect our troops and our allies as war games and provocative war games. Those words normally only appear in North Korean propaganda, but that is how our president in that press conference described those exercises. The U.S. insists that North Korea agreed to denuclearize at the summit. But for Pyongyang, the summit was not about and was never about denuclearization. It was about removing the U.S. threat. That's their goal. And eliminating international sanctions. That's main goal number 2. In fact, Pyongyang has described subsequent efforts, subsequent to that June 12th summit, subsequent U.S. demands that it take concrete steps to denuclearize. They have described those demands as cancerous and gangster-like. Their words, not mine. So the Singapore meeting and the North Korean actions and statements have provided us, I believe, with some, I would call it strategic clarity about North Korea's thinking. The U.S. intelligence community, the International Atomic Energy Agency, a special committee of the UN Security Council, and leading experts on North Korea, including myself, have all concluded that North Korea is not denuclearizing, it is doing the opposite of denuclearizing. It is in the process of enhancing its nuclear weapons capability, even without conducting the kinetic testing of nuclear warheads and ballistic missiles. Even without testing, the North Korean nuclear and missile development continues, and North Korea's nuclear and missile programs are indeed alive and well. And if you don't believe me, you may recall the other day, the entire leadership of the U.S. Intelligence Committee community was on television providing testimony that said exactly that. I'm glad they're finally doing it. I've been saying this for 2 years. So what is going on with North Korea right now in terms of its nuclear and missile developments is in accordance with the North Korean leader's specific instructions. On January 1st, 2018, a little over a year ago, Kim, in his annual New Year's Day address, January 1st, 2018, called on the country to mass produce, his words, nuclear weapons and missiles. And 3 months later, in remarks to the Central Committee of the Korean Workers' Party, the North Korean Communist Party, he lauded the completion of what he called North Korea's state nuclear force. And he declared that nuclear weapons are, and I'm quoting him here, the firm guarantee by which our descendants can enjoy the most dignified and happiest life in the world, unquote. Doesn't sound like a man who's about to give up his nuclear weapons. Pyongyang's intentions, I believe, are quite clear. In December, North Korea reminded Washington of those intentions in a remarkable op-ed that appeared in a pro-North Korean Japanese newspaper, but the op-ed was written by a North Korean affiliated with the North Korean regime. And he reminded Washington that the words denuclearization of North Korea do not appear in the Singapore Summit Declaration. They don't. He's right. Pyongyang helpfully reminded Washington that what it seeks is something very different from the denuclearization of North Korea. They want the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Go back to the definition I provided you earlier. So today the evidence, in my view, including Kim Jong-un's own words, tells us that Pyongyang is not serious about denuclearization. It suggests North Korea intends to keep and even strengthen its capabilities in the nuclear and missile arenas, even as it pursues dialogue with the United States. Today, with a second summit on the horizon, we should acknowledge, in my view, that Pyongyang is not acting in good faith, to say the least. And I believe it's not before time for us to start thinking about Plan B, because Plan A is not working out as we intended. I should say here, by the way, that I had been, up until fairly recently, a strong advocate of the sort of engagement that we've been dealing with the North Koreans via. In other words, talking to the North Korean leader, talking to the people around him, because those are the people who make the decisions. Starting about 8 or 9 years ago, I started to make the argument towards the end of my government career, and I've continued it in recent years, saying if you want the North Koreans to make a decision to give up their nukes, you're talking to the wrong people. Don't talk to the foreign ministry. They wouldn't know what a nuclear weapon was if they stumbled across one in the alley. Talk to the people who make the decisions. Talk to Kim Jong-un. Talk to the inner circle who run North Korea. To his credit, President Trump has done that. But not to his credit, he has told us that they have made the decision to give up the nukes. No, Mr. President, they have not. They have decided to do precisely the opposite. And I've given you some evidence along those lines. So if we're going to go down a different path, I think one of the things we're going to have to do is to reassess some of the assumptions that we've been operating under in dealing with this current approach. We have to acknowledge what the facts tell us about what North Korea is up to. And we also have to acknowledge what North Korea's strategic game plan is, because I think, quite frankly, it's quite clear, and it consists of 5 elements, and let me just run through them quickly. Number 1 element is Pyongyang believes the United States and the international community, at the end of the day, will accept North Korea as a de facto nuclear weapon state. At some point, we will give up and say, we've done everything we can, nothing more we can do. Pyongyang has no illusions that this is going to happen in any formal way. The United States government is never going to say, we formally accept you as a member of the Nuclear Weapons Club. That's not going to happen. But it has already sought to create a new reality through Kim Jong-un's declaration on January 1st of last year that the DPRK had completed its state nuclear force. And it's no accident that this year, in his New Year's address, Kim Jong-un saw no need even to refer to his nuclear forces. Not because he intended to give them up, because they are now a given. This is the new reality. Deal with it. He didn't say that, but that was in effect what he was telling us. North Korea has tried to ease international concerns by suspending nuclear weapons and ballistic missile testing, and by assuring the international community that it will be a responsible nuclear power. And North Korea has also assured the United States and the international community that it has disabled or dismantled elements of its nuclear weapons and ballistic missile testing programs. But having achieved its nuclear testing and ballistic missile testing goals, North Korea is in a position to eliminate those parts of its program that are unnecessary, that have outlived their usefulness, or which could easily be reconstituted if they have to. And that's exactly what they've been doing. So Pyongyang is going to continue to try to make the international community more amenable to its new nuclear status. And the North, perhaps even at this next summit, may offer to permanently suspend or even dismantle its long-range ballistic missile program, the missiles that could potentially hit the United States. That would be a very canny step, and it would be a step that President Trump would find incredibly appealing for obvious reasons. I'd be eliminating the nuclear threat of missiles aimed at the United States. But it would leave North Korea's short and medium-range missiles carrying nuclear weapons still in place. Those missiles threaten our allies in the Asia-Pacific region and threaten all of our military bases and American civilians and military people on those military bases. Pyongyang may also offer arms control negotiations with the United States. A North Korean once told me that our goal is to deal with you as one nuclear weapon state with another. Could be what they're doing right now. Think about that. And the North may also propose a long-term negotiating process aimed at the goal of denuclearization. Ideally for Pyongyang, the more substantial and verifiable and irreversible steps it would have to take towards denuclearization would be deferred to the distant future. And this would amount, in effect, to deferring what it has no intention of doing, denuclearization. So for North Korea, time is its friend. And here is why I am troubled by the fact that several times President Trump has said, we are in no hurry. You may have heard me say these words. We are in no hurry to end North Korea's nuclear weapons program. Music to the ears of Pyongyang, because they are in no hurry either. The second strategic goal is what I call normalization. Pyongyang wants to normalize its relations with the international community. The goal is to gain acceptance of North Korea as a normal country, a country that you can do business with, albeit a country that just happens to have nuclear weapons. The North's diplomacy and its diplomatic swagger are possible precisely because North Korea has reached its nuclear and missile-related goals. So they don't need to brag about that anymore. What they want is to engage us as a normal country. I think North Korea has actually largely succeeded in this normalization process. You'll notice the speed with which South Korea has fallen over itself to engage North Korea in a whole range of enterprises, and the speed with which the United States has responded positively to his overtures, regardless of how sincere they are. We saw this phenomenon again this January 1st when South Korea's Blue House, the equivalent to the White House, reacted immediately and enthusiastically to Kim Jong-un's New Year's address. This was despite the fact that Kim said nothing about denuclearization in that speech, and despite the fact that he called for South Korea to abandon its alliance relationship with the United States and effectively told South Korea, you need to decide what you want, a security relationship with the United States or a reconciliation process with us. That's what he threw out in that January 1st speech. Go back and read it if you haven't read it. It's really interesting. Kim Jong-un has sought to portray himself as a normal leader, a reasonable interlocutor, and a statesman. You may have seen the photos of him delivering his speech in the leather armchair with the library atmosphere in his office on January 1st, just looking like a regular guy in a business suit and a necktie. This is a man who has killed hundreds of thousands of North Koreans, his uncle, his brother, and heaven knows who else. And to some extent, he's succeeded in this effort to normalize himself in the view of the international community. Our president has praised Kim Jong-un as a negotiator and called him honorable, and he's called him a man of courage. South Korea's president has been similarly fulsome in his praise of the North Korean leader. I think we should expect further efforts by the North Koreans to convince us that they should be welcome into the international community. The third goal of the North Koreans is to, what I call, change the subject. North Korea wants to shift the main topic of negotiations with the United States away from what Washington wants to emphasize, denuclearization, and instead talk about the subjects that North Korea wants to talk about: improving relations, easing sanctions and pressure, eliminating the U.S. military threat, and ending the state of war on the Korean Peninsula. That's Pyongyang's agenda. That latter goal, ending the state of war on the Korean Peninsula, is particularly interesting. You should watch for it in the next summit because there may be some reference to it in the document. But that goal is particularly important for North Korea since it would eliminate the rationale for the continued U.S. military presence in South Korea. If we're at peace, why do you have troops here? That would be their argument. hold that thought. The main message Kim Jong-un conveyed to the United States in his January 1st speech this year relates to this particular element of North Korea's game plan. Kim demanded that the United States relax its sanctions on North Korea and ease its pressure campaign and cease its unilateral demands. Translation, stop asking us to take concrete denuclearization steps. And Kim also said that a failure of the United States to do that, to do those things, would compel the United States, compel North Korea to explore a new way to defend the sovereignty of our country and the supreme interests of our state. That's very tame language for North Korea, but it basically says, we have recourse if you don't do what we want you to do. In other words, go back down the path of nuclear weapons development. The fourth element of the game plan is what I call, and this is particularly important, creating the illusion of denuclearization. Pyongyang has characterized its suspension of nuclear and ballistic missile testing and the destruction of some entrance tunnels to its nuclear testing site as denuclearization steps. It's true that those actions have reduced tensions and limited North Korea's ability to rapidly improve its nuclear and missile capabilities, but they do not constitute denuclearization. The evidence tells us that North Korea's nuclear and missile programs are continuing, even in the absence of the testing that they have suspended. And unfortunately, North Korea has succeeded in creating the illusion that it is denuclearizing. And to the extent that we, in the United States and our South Korean allies, give credence to this assertion that they are denuclearizing, it allows North Korea to shirk its responsibility to denuclearize and to divert attention away from the fact that they are doing the opposite of denuclearizing. Fifth element of North Korea's game plan is what I call sharpening the wedge. A goal of North Korea is to drive a wedge between the United States and its South Korean ally. There are troubling signs that North Korea is doubling down on this effort and that North Korea now sees a real opportunity to damage the alliance going forward. Pyongyang's goal remains the unification of the Korean Peninsula under its rule. This cannot be achieved as long as there is a U.S.-South Korea alliance and U.S. troops on the Korean Peninsula. And while Pyongyang cannot drive the United States off the peninsula, it knows that political dynamics within South Korea are shifting, and difficulties between the United States and its South Korean ally are ripe for exploitation, and they have been exploiting them. Pyongyang recognized very early on that with the implosion of the conservative government in Seoul and the resignation of its president and the election of a progressive government in South Korea, there was an opportunity, and the North has wasted no time in trying to take advantage of it. Kim Jong-un's speech last year was cannily crafted to appeal to pan-Korean nationalism, to a romantic and aspirational notion of reconciliation and reunification in the South. It was also designed to appeal to Korean pride, national pride, to latent anti-American sentiment in South Korea, which exists, and to an ideological stratum of South Korean society that remains somewhat sympathetic to the North, if truth be told. Kim's message last year struck a very powerful chord in South Korean thinking, and it has resulted in this acceleration of North-South contact and dialogue. You remember the Olympics last year, which followed the speech. You remembered all the reconciliation talks, the family reunification visits. We've now seen the destruction of some of the guard posts in the DMZ. We've now seen a no-fly zone established over the DMZ, by the way, which prevents our reconnaissance aircraft from looking into North Korea. And since the North Koreans don't fly reconnaissance aircraft near the DMZ, no problem for them. We are hampered, they are not. And you've seen some other developments between North and South. All of this dialogue between North and South happened so quickly that it began to raise concerns in Washington that things were going too far, too fast. And contradictions arose between the pace and scope of North-South dialogue that South Korea was pursuing and U.S. insistence that we needed to keep sanctions in place and keep the pressure on North Korea. And there were worries in the United States that military steps taken by the North and the South could undermine readiness, could undermine intelligence gathering, as I just suggested, and undermine bilateral training with our allies. And all of those things happened to some degree. There was concern that Seoul seemed to be serving as North Korea's friend in court, as it argued for preemptively easing sanctions. And Seoul even argued for positions that Pyongyang had stopped pursuing, such as issuing a unilateral declaration of the end of the Korean War. In that speech last year, Kim Jong-un called for Seoul to end the abnormal situation on the Korean Peninsula, whereby South Korea sides with the United States, and he called for Seoul and Pyongyang, North and South Korea, to pursue sovereign or independent reunification. Translation, without the Americans involved. He picked up on that theme again in his speech on January 1st of this year, and he made the choice that South Korea faces even starker. Choose the Americans and your alliance with them, or choose continuation of the reconciliation process with us. That strikes a responsive chord among some South Koreans. Because Washington was so nervous about the pace that South Korea was moving at, they formed a joint working group with South Korea to coordinate our respective approaches on diplomacy and other issues, and hopefully there'll be fewer differences between Washington and Seoul, but that's not to say that they're gone. But Kim Jong-un's speech on January 1st this year suggests that he believes that Seoul continues to be a soft target of North Korean propaganda and of North Korean calls for reconciliation and cooperation. And Kim is probably encouraged in thinking along these lines by reports that some South Korean figures, including some people that I know, are saying that the South Korean government should somehow coach North Korea in how to deal with the Americans. That the United States should preemptively ease sanctions on North Korea, even without denuclearization, and that a peace treaty would lead to the end of the United Nations command, the overall military command that we're the head of there. These are all North Korean goals. And North Korea may also be taking some comfort from those in South Korea who argue that South Korea should rid itself of its alliance with the United States. And there are some in South Korea making this case. Not the majority, but some. So I think Kim Jong-un will continue to press the ROK to revise its alliance relationship with the United States, including at the summit. That message will appeal to some in the South, and it may even appeal to an American president who has said on a number of occasions that he's prepared to remove U.S. troops from Korea. Kim Jong-un is no doubt encouraged by the recent resignation of Secretary of Defense Mattis, who had been one of the strongest advocates of a tough approach on North Korea and a tough advocate of strong U.S.-South Korea relations. The surprising decision to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria and Afghanistan was also, I suspect, welcome news in Pyongyang. And Mattis's departure leaves the U.S.-ROK alliance open to the impulses, I believe, of an American president who has made no secret of his opposition to America's traditional military alliances and who, as I said, has called on several occasions for the end of our military presence in Korea. So, as we approach the summit, we are in a problematic period. The signs are pretty clear, I think, about what North Korean intentions are. The game plan that North Korea has laid out, I think, is clearer than it's ever been. I am not arguing against diplomacy. I'm not arguing against engagement with North Korea, but let's go into this with our eyes wide open. Kim Jong-un continues to attack the existence of the U.S.-South Korea alliance. He continues to try to appeal to sympathetic elements in the South. He continues to try to carve off thinner and thinner pieces of salami of his nuclear weapons and ballistic missile program that he no longer needs because he intends to keep the bulk of it and try to sell that to the United States for whatever he can get at the next summit. And he's dealing with the enigmatic impulses of an American president who has questioned the very value of the U.S. ROK alliance, which is so fundamental to preserving peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. So, with all of that problematic stuff as background, let me conclude my remarks and open the floor for questions, but not before saying thank you.
Let me start off by, a little differently, by posing some questions relative to what you've covered. One of them is that you focus rightly on North Korea's ambitions and their actions. Last Wednesday on the PBS Evening News, Nick Schifrin did a piece, an extensive piece, in which he quotes the U.S. chief negotiator, Steve Biegun, and comes to the conclusion. Now he quotes him. He showed a number of recent videos of Biegun's remarks, I believe out in California, out at Stanford, and concludes that the U.S. appears to be moving closer to the North Korean position. North Korea as an important place in the future of Northeast Asia, the end of the Korean War, not just an armistice, but an improving relations, the sequencing of major events, the lifting of sanctions versus denuclearization, the complete list of missiles and weapons. We'll get there at some point. Biegun has said quite visibly, there might be a roadmap for stuff like shared understanding, which we don't have, defined concrete deliverables, et cetera, et cetera. So my question to you, Evans, is this a realistic picture of our current negotiating position? Is this really a watering down of previous U.S. positions? Is the U.S. prepared at this point for another high-profile meeting in a couple of weeks? And what if all that might upset our apple cart on our way to dealing with this in the next month or so?
Great question. I know Steve Biegun.
But you taught me. You taught me. That's a good thing.
Steve is a very capable, smart individual who I was chatting outside before we came in here, telling people an anecdote of the first time Steve Biegun came to my home when I was in charge of our embassy in Korea, and I was almost responsible for his demise. Steve, as you may have seen on television, is a really big guy. He's like 6'6", 6'7", something like that. And he was at my house for dinner with his boss, Senator Billy Frist from Tennessee. And he got up from the dinner table to go to the washroom, and I pointed him in the direction of the guest bathroom. And as it turned out, the upper sill of the door was about yay high on Steve Biegun's head, and he walked right into it and collapsed on the floor. And the last time I communicated with him, he reminded me of that story, and I had forgotten it. But anyway, good to know that he's healthy and working hard. He's a very capable guy. His specialty is not Korea. His specialty is sort of general foreign policy and national security issues. But he's more than capable of handling this job if given the right support from above. If you haven't read his remarks at Stanford, they are really worth a very careful read, because it's one of the more schizophrenic presentations I've ever seen. I originally read the initial Reuters report on his remarks, and I was quite impressed. They reported that he had acknowledged, the first time a senior U.S. government official had acknowledged what I have just told you several times today, that we don't have a common definition with the North Koreans of what denuclearization even means. That's a pretty fundamental difference to have when the whole purpose of what we're engaged in with North Korea is denuclearization. We don't even agree what the word means. So that was an important thing for him to acknowledge. He also said that the United States has options. If the North Koreans are not prepared to resolve this diplomatically, well, we have options that we can pursue. And I went, wow, that's a pretty tough-minded statement coming from Steve Biegun. And he said several other things that I was quite impressed with. It was a very hard-edged thing, but he left the door open for dialogue and negotiation, as any good diplomat would do. But then someone sent me the text of what he said, and I read the rest of it. And what you've just summarized is pretty much what he said. And it contained a whole list of things that the United States was prepared to do, even without the achievement of North Korea's denuclearization or efforts to prime the pump and bring about denuclearization. And the first thing that sprang to mind was, oh my heavens, this is the policy that we pursued in 1998. Reward, benefits being provided to North Korea in the hope that it will prime the pump and put them in the right frame of mind to give up their nuclear weapons. It was a policy worth pursuing back in 1998, before they had nuclear weapons. It didn't work. I was the organizer and the pen behind a lot of the policy proposals. We can do A and B and C and D, and in the hope that this will get them to go down the path we want. It didn't work. If providing North Korea with preemptive concessions and incentives and rewards did not work to denuclearize North Korea before they began testing nuclear weapons, why will it work now? This is a fundamental problem I have with the approach that we may be taking now. He mentioned a desire to end the Korean War. Everybody wants to end the Korean War. Anybody here doesn't want to end the Korean War? That's a wonderful thought. But at what price? The price that we may be paying for ending the war the way the North Koreans want to end the war is to remove the justification for our military presence in Korea, which would lead to a reopening of the Korean War on the Korean Peninsula. And so without getting hard, firm progress on denuclearization, we need to be really careful about throwing carrots out too soon, making concessions too soon. I'm not saying that I'm against concessions. There's a role for concessions. There will come a time, if the North Koreans are serious about denuclearization, in which we can offer substantial concessions and easing of sanctions and all the things that are on North Korea's list, except the withdrawal of U.S. troops. That's not their business. But I'm afraid that there was a little bit too much in the way of concession-oriented language in the rest of his presentation that I saw, and that made me a little worried about where this next round of summitry may be going. Having said that, we will be more prepared for this summit than we certainly were for the June 12th summit last year. That does not mean that we will be prepared.
Tyler?
Yeah, in that same talk, Begin.
Did we get a mic to tie, or tie to the mic to the tie? Either way.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, in that same talk at Stanford, Begin, if I remember correctly, specifically said the U.S. has no intention of trying to produce regime change in North Korea going forward. Now, isn't that a little bit of a shift where we specifically say, no way are we going to go any further than a request or a demand for denuclearization, nothing else beyond that?
Yeah.
Does that make a difference?
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because another component of U.S. policy over the last 25 years has been providing security assurances to the North Koreans. When I went with former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry to Pyongyang in 1999, spring of 1999, carried in my pocket a letter from the President of the United States, President Clinton, to Kim Jong-il, then the North Korean leader, providing him with security assurances that America had no intention of attacking, destabilizing, or doing away with the regime. Why did we have that letter? Because the North Koreans said they needed something like that. They wanted to be assured of America's good intentions. This was the second time that we have provided such security assurances to the United States at their request, and we've done it 2 other times since. And so what he did the other day was in keeping with that. It didn't work. We provided security assurance after security assurance, guarantee after guarantee to the North Koreans to make them feel at ease, to assure them that we have no hostile intention. Those were the words that they wanted us to use. We have no hostile intention towards you. And they said, in return for that assurance, we assure you we will be prepared to go down the path of denuclearization. Well, here we are umpteen years later, and they've got nuclear weapons. So that didn't work either. And my question to Steve, if he was here today, would be, Steve, why do you think it's going to work now? They have the nukes. They have South Korea in a good place, in their view, because the South Koreans are urging the United States to ease sanctions. The Chinese are urging the United States to ease sanctions. The Russians are urging the United States to ease sanctions. And now we hear in Steve's presentation in Stanford that we may be even prepared to do that as well, preemptively, without getting the concrete denuclearization steps that we want. So it's a feeling of deja vu I have, that we've tried this stuff before. I know because I wrote some of the policy proposals to do this, and it didn't work. And the reason I say the things I say today is because of the experience, the personal experience I and others have had in trying all of these other approaches, and they failed.
Steve?
You know, I was in high school when we started this Korean War, which was a couple of years ago. And I've seen a number of presidents try a number of different things, and you've been intimately involved with many of them. And not one damn thing has worked. So I'm asking you, we now made you the chief negotiator. What way forward do you see to make any progress whatsoever on this issue? You've already shown clearly what does not work, but what would work?
The last time I was here, I laid out what I thought was the one thing that we had not tried that had some potential to work. And it was what the Obama administration began to do in its last year in office, and what President Trump began to do in his first year in office. And that was, he called it maximum pressure. I like to call my approach massive pressure. I've already described all the other approaches that we took over the years, but the one thing that we've never done with the North Koreans is to go right to the heart of their ability to exist as a state. To put so many sanctions and so much pressure and so much isolation, to take so many steps overtly and covertly, to put so much diplomatic pressure, trade, economic sanctions, banking sanctions, and other things on North Korea, that it begins to shake the very foundation of the North Korean regime and begins to create, in the North Korean mind, their worst nightmare. And their worst nightmare is the collapse of their regime and the collapse of their system. I'm not advocating regime change in North Korea. I'm advocating and have advocated that we need to put the right amount of pressure on the North Korean regime to convince them that if they do not come to the table and negotiate seriously denuclearization, they are risking the collapse of their regime. And there's only one thing that North Koreans value more than nuclear weapons, and that's the existence of their regime. And we've never tried that. The president, to his credit, talked about maximum pressure and sanctions, et cetera. And there are today more sanctions on North Korea than we've ever had before, but nowhere near what I would identify as maximum. If maximum is here, right now we're about here. There's a lot of leeway in what we could do on North Korea, and a lot of things that we could do to North Korea that we have not done, including things like a naval blockade or a naval quarantine and other things. Putting sanctions on international banks, including Chinese banks that do business with North Korea, that would hurt. China is North Korea's lifeline. So where we are right now is because the president has removed the timeline, because good people like Steve Biegun are now hinting at sanctions, because the South Koreans, the Chinese, and the Russians are pushing the United States to ease sanctions, the high tide of pressure on North Korea is now receding. And it will recede even further. So my plan A, or my plan B, as the case may be, is to go back to something resembling the massive pressure campaign that I just described to you, which is where, as I said, the Obama administration was heading in its last year and where the Trump administration was heading in its first year, until the president became fascinated with the idea of personal diplomacy with Kim Jong-un.
Would the Chinese tolerate that kind of pressure?
They will not be happy. But our job is not to keep the Chinese happy. Our job is to solve this problem.
Thank you very much. It's a fascinating presentation. My question is, the Chinese, at one point, I thought they were going to try to rein in Kim Jong-un. And if, assuming the worst-case scenario, the U.S. doesn't have any military presence at all, do you think that China will rein him in, or do you think Japan will rein him in, or somebody will pick up, fill the void?
if you're going to wait around for the Chinese to compel North Korea to denuclearize, it's going to be a long wait.
But do you think they'll prevent him from
Yeah.
using the weapons,
Yeah.
I guess is my question.
They already did. In 2017, you remember fire and fury, you remember all the rhetoric, you remember, I even said here last year, it was as close to war as I thought we'd ever been since the Korean War on the Korean Peninsula. I was really concerned about where things were headed. The United States and the international community, the UN Security Council, with Chinese support for those votes in the Security Council, during the course of the year in 2017, put lots of sanctions and pressure on North Korea. One of the reasons that the North Koreans blinked and came to the table in early 2018 was because of that pressure. Not because it was shaking the foundations of the regime yet, but because it had the potential to do that in another year or two time. So the Chinese were actually helpful back then in voting in favor of those resolutions, putting their own sanctions on. At the same time, they were looking the other way as a lot of Chinese businesses and banks and firms did business surreptitiously with the North Koreans, just enough to keep the North Koreans afloat. That continues today, by the way. You've seen all the reports in the press in the middle of the night, Chinese freighters tying up next to North Korean freighters, transferring coal and oil, et cetera. We have satellite photographs of this going on, so the Chinese can't deny it's happening. It is happening. So there are holes in the sanction regime, and the holes are getting bigger, quite frankly, allowing stuff to go through. But to their credit, the Chinese helped put in place a sanctions regime that caused the North Koreans to blink, which is the point I was trying to make earlier. The way to get the North Koreans to the table seriously is not to ease up on the pressure, it's to double down on the pressure. Not for the purpose of destroying the regime, although you could. That'd be dangerous. You'd break a lot of crockery. But the idea, as I said, is to convince the North Korean leader that he has no choice. The choice is refuse to denuclearize and risk the collapse of his regime, or denuclearize and have a better life for himself and his people. Let's give him that choice.
No, there's somebody up there.
Thank you. I wonder if I can just shift you just slightly, because you've been talking about sanctions, and I was wondering if, with your expertise, you could tell us a little bit about the economy of North Korea, and particularly in the last 12 to 18 months.
Yep.
Has there been improvement? Is it still deteriorating? We don't get much data from there, and I'd just be curious about your take on that.
Yeah, we don't get much data from there intentionally. The North Koreans thrive on what I call playing the mystery card. The less you know about them, the stronger their hand is. The answer to your question is it really depends on where you are in North Korea. If you're in downtown Pyongyang, you're in a place that has dollar stores or euro stores where you can buy interesting commodities, colored televisions, and all sorts of things, where the elites, who are the only people who live in Pyongyang, it's about 2 million people or so, live by North Korean standards pretty darn well. They have all the food they need. They have most of the electricity they need, although there are power shortages almost every day. They have apartments. They have transportation. They have their own quarter in the city where the party elites live. Life is not bad if you're a member of the elite in Pyongyang. But if you go outside the capital city, if you travel in the countryside, things are not good. Things are not good there. We're not back in a famine situation, which is where we were in the 90s, but life is hard, life is tough, disease is rampant, electricity doesn't exist in many areas of rural North Korea. Food supplies are tenuous. People are getting barely enough to eat, but they're not eating their full ever. It really is two different countries. The Pyongyang that we see and all those pictures that you see, these travel pictures, welcome to mysterious North Korea. But they don't let those photographers go out to the countryside and see how the North Korean people live. Most assessments of North Korea suggest that the economy, the overall economy, continues to contract, that they are more dependent than ever on the Chinese, which is a tool that we can use, that they are increasingly burdened by international sanctions, which once again makes the case for my argument to turn up the heat on sanctions. And the economy just overall is not thriving, and it will not thrive. The overall trend is downward in North Korea. And so there's an opportunity here to try this mechanism that I suggested. Once again, I'm not in the business of starving people or collapsing governments. That's not what I do. But if you put enough heat on a regime that is struggling and suffering as much as North Korea is, I think they'll make the right choice. I hope they'll make the right choice.
Thank you.
Could you explain militarily if South Korea has a bigger population, like massively more wealth? Why can't they defend themselves? Why has it been a problem for the several decades?
The population of South Korea is double the population of North Korea. The military capabilities of South Korea are impressive, but there are key elements of their defense that we actually provide, electronics, information systems, warfare, a lot of bells and whistles that America brings to any war that most other countries just don't have. The North Koreans, in a population of only 24, 25 million people, have an armed force of over 1 million. That's bigger than our military. And most of them are forward deployed, close to the DMZ, within 50 to 100 kilometers of the DMZ, offensively arrayed. South Korea's military is basically armed and trained to defend rather than to attack. Advantages in wars like that tend to go to the attacker rather than to the defender. If the United States withdrew from South Korea, South Korea would have to go on a massive spending spree to try to duplicate all the capabilities that we have there. Air assets, naval assets, satellite assets, cyber warfare assets, all those things that we do so well that most other armies in the world just can't do at all, or certainly not as well as we do. But there's another card that the North Koreans hold: nuclear weapons.
Right, but even before nuclear weapons, that situation still existed with it. It was felt that we needed U.S. troops. And it sounds like all the things you said are basically South Korean choices, whatever limit on resources South Korea has. North Korea has.
I don't think
massively
South
more
Korea. I don't think
limitations.
South Korea has the wherewithal to buy, build, equip, and train a military of the sort that it would be required to deal with the North on its own. You cannot discount the nuclear factor. I'm not suggesting that the North Koreans would use nuclear weapons, although they might. What I'm suggesting is that if you have a South Korea opposing a North Korea, a South Korea without a U.S. alliance, a South Korea without a U.S. military presence, facing a North Korea that has the capabilities that it has, and a North Korea that has nuclear weapons, I know who wins that fight, and it's not South Korea.
No, that's a well-taken point,
Yeah.
but it meant just the same situation existed, let's say 1995, before North Korea had nuclear weapons.
Yep.
So I guess my question goes back to historically then.
Yep.
Why did South Korea need U.S. assistance before nuclearization?
The South Korean military today is more capable than it was back in the 80s or 90s, et cetera. So they are a lot better than they used to be, but still, I put my money on the North Koreans, who are more dedicated, who are better trained for the type of warfare that they would conduct. And let's also remember that you've got about 20 million hostages that the North Koreans hold, called the capital city of Seoul, which, forget nuclear weapons, is within North Korean artillery range. South Korea cannot hit North Korea's capital other than with long-range cruise missiles. Every frontline gun in North Korea can hit South Korea's capital. That's a game changer right there. You lose your capital, you lose hundreds of thousands and perhaps millions of South Koreans right off the bat. That's a big factor right there.
Let's get a microphone here.
Yes.
She's got one.
Oh, she has.
Thank you. I would like to have your insight into China's role in this whole thing. It's like the elephant in the room is China,
Yep.
not the United States anymore.
The Chinese nightmare is not a nuclear-armed North Korea. The Chinese nightmare is a North Korea collapsing on its border, leading to chaos, anarchy, loose nukes, civil war, or a second Korean War. That's China's nightmare. That's always been China's nightmare since 1953. China knows we're not going to attack North Korea unless they attack us. China knows that South Korea is not going to attack North Korea unless they attack South Korea. So the real thing that the Chinese are concerned about is the possibility of precipitate collapse of the North Korean regime, which would lead to chaos, in their view, and problems on their border, since they share a border with North Korea. So, to prevent that, the Chinese have been willing to do more, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of signing on to sanctions and putting pressure on North Korea, et cetera, et cetera. But the Chinese will always, and have always, stopped short of doing as much as we would want them to do, because in the Chinese view, to do more would bring about the collapse that they fear. So there are limits to it. Okay. So 2017, Chinese were playing helpful cop with us. 2018 as well. Now they've shifted into a more neutral position because North Korea is not testing nuclear weapons. North Korea is not testing ballistic missiles. Nobody's talking about imminent war in the Korean Peninsula. This is a good situation if you're a Chinese leader. This is good. Now is the time, if you're a Chinese leader, to start turning things the other way. So it is no accident that Kim Jong-un has been to China 4 times for summits with the Chinese leader. The Chinese were actually concerned last year that because they had put so much heat on North Korea, that they were allowing North Korea to drift out of China's orbit. And they found their influence in North Korea diminishing, which is another nightmare of China's. So now you see the Chinese re-engaging with the North Koreans, inviting Kim Jong-un to come, reminding Kim Jong-un that we are your lifeline and you need us to survive. So that's the game the Chinese are playing right now. It's completely predictable. But there are limits to how far China will go. And I think we've seen China reach those limits now. In an ideal world, we could sit down quietly and have a conversation with the Chinese in which we could describe a future for the Korean Peninsula in which there would be no Korea, no North Korea, no nuclear weapons, no military provocations, unified Korea that would be in their interests and our interests. We actually had some quiet conversations with the Chinese along those lines 2 or 3 years ago. Chinese don't want to talk about that now. They're in a different place.
Is part of that answer a function of what China assesses as the U.S. administration's position or capability?
They
I mean,
s-
from a military.
Well, they see the United States as making the concessions or prepared to make the concessions that will move the situation even further in China's direction. North Korea wants the U.S. military out of the Korean Peninsula. Guess who else wants the U.S. military out of the Korean Peninsula?
Thank you for speaking today, very informative. I want to go back to your idea of maximum pressure. I thought you used the word covert, but we have a law against assassinating heads of
I was
state.
afraid you were going to ask this question.
You used the word blockade, which I understand is an act of war, and I don't think you're advocating that we initiate a war. Help me understand what I can see the administration do which would indicate maximum pressure, and I understand the banking. What else should I look for? Because I can see the relaxation of sanctions. What are some of the indicators of maximum pressure?
I am increasingly convinced that the days of maximum pressure are over, as I suggested in my remarks. I don't think we're going back then. I advocate it. I would continue. Someone asked me the question, what's your plan B? I told you what my plan B is. To be totally frank with you, I don't think we're going back there. But if we were, some of the components of that would be, in addition to the human rights, banking, travel, financial flows, investment, trade, and other measures that we are taking, would be to apply some of those measures to third countries that are doing business with the North Koreans, including Chinese banks, which are exposed in North Korea. But there are things that we can do in the covert realm. I'm not advocating assassinations. Although, if you go back, and you can find this on YouTube, the Secretary of State of the United States has advocated decapitation of the North Korean leadership. The same Secretary of State that you see advocating diplomacy with the North Korean leader is on the record as having advocated, when he was CIA director, decapitation of the North Korean leadership. I kid you not. There are things that we could do. I'm not in government anymore, but still, I need to be careful not to tip too many hands here. There are things that we could do to North Korea's economy, to its banking system, to its ability to provide power for its industries, to its communication systems, to its internal banking system, that could wreak havoc in North Korea.
Would you give South Korea nuclear bombs?
No.
No.
Why make the problem worse? which is something that would do. There are things that we could do in the military arena that we actually were doing in the Obama administration and in the first couple of years of the Trump administration. The president has announced the suspension of these major exercises. Put them back on. Every time we exercise, the North Koreans have to respond. And when they respond with their exercises, they break airplanes, they break tanks, they use fuel. They don't like to do that. It's one of the many reasons why they are so happy that the President of the United States suspended those exercises. They know we're not going to attack them, but they have to respond. Their own troops have to respond when we do things. I mentioned the possibility of a quarantine or an embargo. If we discover, and we are discovering, that the North Koreans are continuing to violate with their ships current UN Security Council sanctions on fuel going into North Korea and other goods going into North Korea, we can go back to the UN Security Council and say we would like to be authorized to stop all North Korean ships, conduct a search. We have the capability to do that, together with the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Australians, and others. We have ships on station that could do that. And so that would be short of an embargo, but it would in effect be a quarantine, if you will, on North Korea. And there are 100 other things that we could do, but you get my drift.
I think we have a question right here.
Thank you very much. You briefly mentioned that South Korea seems to be having its own agenda moving forward and trying to establish relations with North Korea, actually not acting as a team player. It's probably politically expedient for them to do that because they do have a large part of the population that wants American troops out of the country. It's enough already after 60 years or 75 years, whatever it is. I understand that, but the U.S. does have an ability to control South Korea. After all, we are one of their largest trading partners, if not the largest trading partner of South Korea. And why wouldn't we want to rein them in a little bit? That's my question.
I would argue that we have already reined them in a bit. You may remember a few months ago, the president said something remarkable.
Back there.
The South Korean foreign minister said something about reopening one of the major South Korean investment projects in North Korea, which is under UN sanction, by the way, so it can't be reopened. But she mentioned the possibility of that. And a reporter, an enterprising reporter, asked the President of the United States, what do you think about that? And he said, they would have to talk to us first, because they can't do anything without us. It was pretty blunt. A South Korean,
Said that?
President Trump said that.
Well, that doesn't mean anything.
Well, it means something along the lines of what you were suggesting. And I was quite shocked that he said that. I actually, as undiplomatic as it was, and it was, as blunt as it was, and it sure was, a South Korean reporter asked me, what did I think of the president's statement? And I said it was rude, it was undiplomatic, it was blunt, and it was absolutely essential. He laughed the way you did. But it was necessary, I think, to rein our allies in, and we did. And we set up that joint working group with South Korea. And so now, when South Korea is about to make any move that has an impact on the overall balance between North and South, economically or militarily, et cetera, it goes through this joint working group. And the chair on the U.S. side is Steve Biegun. So there's now a mechanism in place to prevent things from going off the rails. You said that, I think you implied that most South Koreans would be in favor of a reduction or the elimination of the
I
U.S.
said there's a large
Oh, large,
proportion
okay,
of the
okay.
population.
Yeah. The majority, the vast majority of the South Korean people want us there. A minority would like us to leave, but a minority. But you do have a progressive government in Seoul. And that progressive governments of the left in Korea, have traditionally been eager to engage the North, reward the North, open up relations with the North, achieve reconciliation, and some of them have, as I said, this romantic notion of reunification someday, a notion that's not shared by the majority of Korean people. And I guess if I were a patriotic South Korean, I'd probably be pursuing that agenda too. South Korea, today, I think it would be fair to say, prioritizes the reconciliation process over the denuclearization process. And that's the problem that we have right now. They're chomping at the bit to do more with North Korea because they see this as a historic opportunity to try to achieve the reconciliation that they've long sought in the Korean Peninsula. I guess that's understandable. But what's standing in the way of that reconciliation and needs to be removed before we can achieve that reconciliation is North Korea's nuclear threat. And that's our top priority. So there is this conflict of priorities here between ourselves and our allies. We're managing it okay. I don't foresee any massive breakdown in the system. I don't foresee a breakdown in the alliance system over this stuff. I think we've got it under control right now. But we need to be mindful of the need not to get on the wrong side of Korean nationalism. But importantly, as good as my knowledge is of this, Kim Jong-un's knowledge of this game is even better. He knows how to play the South Koreans. You look at Kim Jong-un's last two speeches, they are brilliantly crafted to appeal to these interesting political groupings in South Korea. He knows how to push their buttons in interesting ways. And so far, it's working.
First off,
It's working.
first of all, thank you for your presentation. I think it was great.
Thank you.
I have a question about the civilian population outside of Pyongyang. Okay? I've seen documentaries. Generally, there's an ophthalmologist who goes there and performs surgery on
Yeah.
removing cataracts.
I know.
And the individual that's been operated on and has recovered some sight doesn't say anything to the doctor. He or she goes up to this picture of Kim Jong-un, right, and thanks him. And they get down on their knees to do it. And it gives the impression, at least to me, that the general population considers him a god. And I don't know how, unless it was somebody close to him, how you could have an overthrow of the government.
It's pretty hard for me to imagine any violent overthrow of the North Korean government. Anything along those lines that would have to happen from the very top. It would have to happen from inside the inner circle. And they have a stake in preserving the system, not in overthrowing it. Have you ever seen the movie Death of Stalin?
Yes.
You remember the scenes in the Lubyanka prison as people are being shot?
Yeah.
The last words that they cry out just before the fellow says fire?
God bless Stalin.
Yeah, long live Stalin. That's North Korea. I mean, that is the system that's in place there. It is Stalinism taken to the nth level. Everything in praise of the leadership, everything in praise of the leader, everything because of the leader. And if your eyesight has been saved by this, this good American doctor who's operated on your eyes, the smart political move for you when you've recovered your sight is to thank your leadership rather than the American for having done the operation. It's just, that's the way the system is.
looking ahead,
Got stereo mics here, okay.
shall I go ahead? Yeah, looking ahead to the summit, do you have a sense of John Bolton's influence on Trump's, persona at the summit? To what extent is Trump listening to John, and what are the dynamics of the people who are hopefully going to influence our wonderful president?
I know John Bolton. I worked with him at one point and know of his politics and his interesting views and his hard-edged posturing and all that. There's a joke going around Washington these days. Should I say? I'll say it. What the heck? I'm not in government anymore. I can say this. And the joke goes, if John Bolton were alive today, none of this would be happening. Everything I know about him, and I have met him several times, including in the Korean context, during 2 of his visits to Korea when I was serving at the embassy there. Everything I know about him leaves me with the impression that nothing that is happening with respect to our current policy towards North Korea is something that he would approve of.
Nothing.
No. Wouldn't approve of. Yeah. So this is the president's policy. This is the president determined to do what the president wants to do. And those who stand in his way, as we have seen, their political lives or bureaucratic lives are cut short, and that's the reality.
And they're insulted.
Yep, well, that too. And so I think he is hunkering down and doing what he likes to do in places like Iran and other places. But on this particular policy, I don't know that I can detect his fingerprints lately, although previously I could detect his fingerprints in some of the things that were happening in the immediate aftermath of the summit last year, when everybody was in shock at what had happened in Singapore, and the administration began to tack in a slightly different direction. You remember that Secretary Pompeo went to Pyongyang 1 month after the summit, and he went there with a list of demands for the North Koreans. Since the President of the United States had said the North Koreans had agreed to denuclearize, well, Secretary of State went there with a list of demands. And the North Korean response to the list of demands, which was pretty far-reaching stuff, the North Korean response was basically, get the hell out of here, go home.
That was the gangster
Yeah,
response.
exactly. I think Bolton's fingerprints were all over that list of demands. Sir.
Minutes that remain, and thank you for this wonderful segue.
Thank you.
Yeah, clearly the elephant in the room and the new sheriff in town, right, is the president, who last I checked is where the buck stops in terms of setting foreign policy objectives as well as strategy, right? We have civilian control over the military. The generals may advise, they don't need to be listened to. I try to game these things out and understand what's really going to happen, so I try to infer the goals, which to me seem to be twofold for this executive, to get something that he can describe as a foreign policy victory to support his base for re-election, and to pave the way for real estate development of Trump Towers in North Korea.
Good luck with that second one.
And well, he's has spoken about it, and it's an ongoing. I would think that that's kind of his real objective, is to open that up, and he's trying to finagle that and not, get shot down by the negotiators, the generals, the intelligentsia, and the elites.
People like me.
So I'm wondering if you could put on a different hat. I think he's doing well so far. Put on a different hat as how would you advise the president to accomplish those objectives of a foreign policy, something that may build as a victory within the next year, and softening up North Korea for a Trump Tower?
You'll pardon me if I pass on the real estate portion of that, but this is a serious question that you posed here, because you've touched on something that I continue to say in every set of public remarks and everything I write. The president's goal appears to be the creation of the appearance of a diplomatic victory. Not the reality of one, but the appearance of victory. And his current goal actually overlaps with the goal of the North Korean leader, whose goal is to create the appearance of denuclearization without actually denuclearizing. I have no desire to further that goal or to help this president achieve it, because it would leave in place a nuclear threat against American military people, against our allies, against the United States. It would open up the possibility of the proliferation of nuclear material and nuclear weapons from North Korea to other countries around the world or terrorist groups. And it would undermine peace and stability in Northeast Asia. That's just not a goal that, if I were in this government, I would be prepared to pursue. Couldn't do it. I was given an opportunity to be part of the team, and my response was, "Are you kidding me?" The president deserves the loyalty of his team, and as I said to a colleague in the government, I'm not prepared to be loyal to those goals and to that agenda. Can't do it, for all the reasons that I just mentioned. The creation of the appearance of a diplomatic victory, the creation of the appearance of denuclearization, is a tremendous disservice to what we are all about in Northeast Asia, which is the preservation of peace and stability, preservation of strong alliances, and the prevention of war in Northeast Asia. And so, coming out of this next summit, I could almost write the script right now of what the president will say when he steps up to the microphone. I have a checklist of outcomes of the summit. I won't bore you with all of them, but I guarantee you that both sides will declare victory, and the president will say, "I have done what no previous American president has done," which is what he said on June 12th. Parse that sentence and you'll see how nervous that sentence makes me. And we will not be more secure than we were before the summit. We will probably be more insecure than we were before the summit. But he will have successfully created the appearance of victory, and the North Koreans will have given him sufficient numbers of slices of the nuclear and missile salami to allow him to say, "I have done something significant here."
But why a late February meeting?
There may have been a political factor in the timing of that. I'm not sure. I do think that the president is in need of a win, quite frankly, for obvious reasons. I described him in a recent op-ed I wrote as embattled. That's probably the understatement of the year. Things are not going well in several other theaters in which we are operating today. We could be on the brink of a major trade war with China. We are, in the view of most military experts, pulling out of commitments in Syria and Afghanistan precipitately. Even generals who have argued that we ought to think about getting out of Syria and Afghanistan are saying this is not the way to do it. And things are not going all that well in the foreign policy arena. And so that may have been an issue here, that the sooner I can get a win on the scorecard, the better off I'll be. I don't know what his thinking was there.
You didn't mention that the Mueller report may be coming out very shortly.
That's part of the embattled president argument.
In the discussion of the mutual risks and dangers, does it affect the North Koreans in any way?
We can't hear you.
Does it affect the North Koreans in any way that the physical use of any of their nuclear force, at whatever cost and damage to us and our allies, would result in the obliteration in a physical sense of most of North Korea?
Mm-hmm.
Does that enter into their minds in any way, or is this just a condition they won't even think of?
The North Koreans understand well that the use or the impending use of a nuclear weapon against the United States or any of our allies or any of our interests would result in a response by the United States along the lines that you've just suggested. And I know they know that because it was in my talking points when I was a diplomat to say to them, along with other American diplomats who've said the same thing to them. They understand that. It may be that one of the reasons why they have decided to pause where they have paused for the last year in terms of their nuclear weapons development and ballistic missile development is that they know that they have sufficiency, in their view, to deter the United States, to deter others from possibly attacking them by the very existence of this level of nuclear arsenal. And they don't need any more, because any more or any better systems would be regarded as even more threatening by the United States than the systems that they have now. So better, and I'm putting my North Korean leader hat on, better to open up a negotiation now that you have what you need and you know it works and you know what you can hit. Better to open up a negotiation now and see what you can get from the United States and the international community by trading away the superannuated, no longer necessary elements of your nuclear weapons and ballistic missile program, but retain the ability to use, employ, and develop nuclear weapons, either overtly or surreptitiously at some level. And I think that's exactly what the North Korean game plan is. But they understand that the use or threatened use of a nuclear weapon would result in that response. They do. Occasionally in their bombastic bravado, they'll say, oh, we're prepared to take on the United States in a nuclear war. No, they're not. But they also know that the one thing that Uncle Sam is afraid of is a nuclear weapon aimed at or dropped on the United States. And that gives them a certain level of deterrence.
What nonprofits would you suggest I support in order to erode support for the regime?
In order to
Erode support for the regime and increase chances of peaceful.
Wow. You're not trying to ask me about whether there are CIA front operations out there that you can contribute to. I have no idea. Let me answer your question by saying that there are charities out there that are trying to help the North Korean people. I think the very fact that charities are helping the North Korean people in need, whether it's medical needs or other needs, charities that are trying to provide food, as well as medical care. Those are all good causes. There are many of them out there. And I think as part of this summit, you'll see a lifting of some of the restrictions that allow funds to go to those organizations. And whether it's Mercy Corps or whether it's Steve Linton's foundation in South Korea. Steve Linton is one of the doctors who goes up there and treats tuberculosis patients in the north. There's some really good charities out there. Their goal is not to erode support for the regime. But the fact that they are doing work like this and that the North Korean people know that it is the international community that's helping them, that maybe does erode the North Korean regime, or at least its command and control over the people to some extent.
Let me ask a last question. What are you advising your commercial, institutional, governmental clients in terms of where do we make commitments? What kinds of risks are we likely to take? How do we mitigate those risks in dealing with this situation, which, if I understand your remarks, is going to go on for a couple of years? What will we do?
We were moving in the direction of a possible military confrontation towards the end of 2017. I'm absolutely convinced of that. And there were some indicators, I think I mentioned some of them when I was here last time, some very prominent former U.S. four-stars were talking about the possibility of military action in the coming weeks and months. This is at the end of 2017, including the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I also picked up some other indicators that I can't talk about publicly, but I was absolutely convinced of it. We are far away from that now, and that's a good thing. For all of the faults that I've described in the policy and its implementation, for all of the phrase that I use is diplomatic malpractice that's been committed in connection with the first summit and that may be committed in the second summit. War is not the answer to this problem. War is too horrific to think about on the Korean Peninsula. and would result, even if we won at the end of the day, in horrific damage to Seoul, to South Korea, probably to Japan, to U.S. bases, to U.S. troops out there, and to their families out there, even under the best of circumstances. So the fact that we are not on the brink of war is a good thing. The president the other day said something in his State of the Union speech, implying that he had saved us from war in the Korean Peninsula. Well, with all due respect, Mr. President, you were the one taking us to war on the Korean Peninsula, not President Obama. You were the one taking us to war, and thank you that you didn't. But it's going to take a while for this to play out. I still am hopeful that diplomacy, plus the other measures that I talked about, can be looked at seriously again by the administration, because that is a lot more likely to lead to the end state of denuclearization than the track that we're following now. But I do fear that in 2 or 3 years' time, if we were to meet again, I would be doing a postmortem. And in the postmortem, I would open up by saying, let me explain to you why the United States, South Korea, and the international community, at the end of the day, decided that it had no choice but to live with a nuclear-armed North Korea. I'm not advocating that by any means, but I fear that in 2 or 3 years' time, that is maybe where we will end up. And so my advice to potential investors, except for investors in Trump Towers up in North Korea, is, for now, you're okay. Situation is stable. Seoul stock market is doing okay. And military conflict is unlikely on the Korean Peninsula, and that's probably a good thing. Although a certain level of tension can be expected, particularly when this president or the next president wakes up and decides that, you know what, we're now at the point where I have to either do something kinetically to stop this or accept it. My guess is that whoever that president is will opt to accept it.
Quietly, but not.
Quietly. And
Thank you, Evans.
as every North Korea expert says, this is the way you can test somebody who's a real North Korea expert. They will say something outrageous like I just said, and then say, I hope I'm wrong.